A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
You know, Corn, this whole show runs on GPU compute, and we wouldn't be here without Modal.
Seriously. And that's what powers all our text-to-speech. Everything you're hearing right now.
They're an AI infrastructure platform. Developers use them to run GPU workloads in the cloud with zero infrastructure headaches.
If you're building anything with AI, check them out. Modal.com. So, I was looking at our billing dashboard for the podcast's text-to-speech pipeline this morning, and it hit me how much the world has changed in just the last year or two. We just finished migrating our entire Chatterbox voice cloning setup from the old T4 instances over to the L4s, and then eventually straight on to the A10s on Modal. The whole process took, 45 minutes of actual engineering time.
It was remarkably smooth. I think it took longer for us to decide which voice model sounded less like a robot and more like a sleepy sloth than it did to actually swap the underlying silicon. I am Herman Poppleberry, by the way, and you are listening to My Weird Prompts. Today's prompt from Daniel is actually a perfect segue from our morning Slack chat because he wants us to dive into the cold, hard economics of serverless GPU platforms versus actually owning the hardware.
It is a timely one. And just a quick heads up for the listeners, today's episode is actually being powered by Google Gemini 3 Flash, which is handling the script generation. It is a bit of a meta moment, using an AI to talk about the infrastructure that runs AI. But Daniel's question is really the million-dollar question for 26. Is it actually cheaper to rent this stuff by the second, or are we all just suckers for convenience? Because honestly, Herman, I look at the price of some of these top-tier cards, and my wallet starts hiding under the couch.
It is a massive capital expenditure if you go the ownership route, but that is the beauty of the current market maturity. We have reached this point where the serverless aspect of GPUs isn't just a buzzword anymore, it's a genuine shift in how you calculate return on investment. If you look at a platform like Modal, they are offering everything from the entry-level T4s all the way up to the brand new Blackwell B200s, and the pricing is per second. That is the fundamental mechanical shift. You aren't paying for the card to sit in a rack in your basement drawing 50 watts of idle power while you sleep. You pay for the precise duration of the inference.
Right. But let's do some actual math here, because per second sounds cheap until you realize how many seconds there are in a day. If I want to buy a used T4 right now, I'm looking at maybe $500 to $700. On Modal, that same T4 is 59 cents an hour. If my math is right, and it usually is when money is involved, the break-even point is somewhere around 850 hours of runtime. That is only 35 days of continuous use. So if I'm running a bot that stays on 24/7, isn't serverless actually a massive ripoff?
If you are running a 24/7 high-utilization workload, then yes, buying the hardware or at least committing to a reserved instance is almost always going to be more cost-effective. The crossover point is really about utilization rates. If your GPU is active for more than, say, 10 or 12 hours a day, every single day, the rent starts to look like a bad mortgage. But the reality of most AI development, especially for indie devs or small teams like us, is that our workloads are incredibly bursty.
That is the key, isn't it? Bursty. Our TTS pipeline is the perfect example. We generate the audio for these episodes, which takes maybe 20 minutes of heavy compute, and then that GPU sits bone dry for the rest of the day. Maybe we do a few tweaks here and there, or run a few tests, but we are probably only hitting the silicon for 2 hours a day, max.
Well, not exactly, but you hit the nail on the head. Let's look at the A10. That is the card we settled on for our Chatterbox pipeline. Buying an A10 outright would cost us somewhere between $2,800 and $3,300. If we use it for 2 hours a day on Modal at $1.10 per hour, that is $2.20 a day. To reach that $3,000 purchase price, we would have to run this podcast for 1,360 days. That is nearly 4 years.
And in 4 years, that A10 is going to be a paperweight. Or at least, it will be the equivalent of trying to run a modern LLM on a calculator.
That is the hidden cost of ownership that people always forget: depreciation and obsolescence. If you buy a $30,000 H100 today, you aren't just paying for the silicon. You are betting that your workload won't outgrow 80 gigabytes of VRAM in the next 3 years. You are betting that the power delivery in your building can handle 700 watts per card. You are betting that your cooling system won't fail. With serverless, you offload all of that operational risk to the provider. If a better card comes out tomorrow, like the B200, you just change one line in your config file and suddenly you're running on the fastest chips on the planet.
I do like the idea of never having to touch a screwdriver or worry about thermal paste. But there is a catch, right? The cold start problem. I remember back in the early days of serverless, you'd make a request and then sit there for 2 minutes while the provider spun up a container, pulled your model weights from some distant S3 bucket, and finally started the GPU. For a real-time app, that is a death sentence.
That was the deal breaker for a long time, but the engineering on the platform side has basically solved it. Modal, for instance, uses some really clever container image streaming and warm pools. When we trigger our TTS, the latency is negligible because the environment is essentially pre-baked. They reuse containers. If you have a high-volume app, the warmth of your function persists. The scale to zero benefit means you don't pay when it's idle, but the warm start means your users don't feel the lag.
But how does that work in practice if I have a massive model? If I'm trying to load a 70 billion parameter model, that's over 100 gigabytes of data. Surely the network speed alone causes a cold start delay.
You'd think so, but modern serverless platforms use what's called a distributed file system, or instant-on mounting. Instead of downloading the whole model, the system only pulls the specific chunks of the file that the GPU needs at that exact microsecond. It's a bit like Netflix. You don't wait for the whole movie to download before you start watching. You stream the bits you need. This reduces cold starts from minutes to just a few seconds, even for the heavy hitters.
That makes sense. It's basically just-in-time infrastructure. Okay, so let's talk about how to actually choose the right tool for the job. Because I see people all the time saying, I need an H100 to run my image generator. And I'm thinking, buddy, you're renting a Ferrari to go to the grocery store.
That is the most common mistake in AI infrastructure right now. People over-provision because they see the big numbers in the headlines. The framework for choosing a GPU should always start with VRAM video random access memory. You need to match the VRAM to the size of your model. Our Chatterbox model is relatively small, maybe 2 gigabytes of VRAM once it is loaded. If we ran that on an H100 with 80 gigabytes of VRAM, we would be paying $3.95 an hour for 78 gigabytes of memory that is literally doing nothing.
It's like renting a warehouse to store a single shoebox. It's a total waste of capital.
It really is. For lightweight inference, things like text to speech, basic image generation with stable diffusion, or smaller language models like Phi or the tiny llama variants, the T4 at 59 cents an hour or the L4 at 80 cents an hour is almost always the sweet spot. The L4 is actually a fantastic successor to the T4. It has 24 gigabytes of VRAM, which is a 50% increase over the T4, and it is significantly more efficient for Ada Lovelace era kernels.
We moved to the A10 because we wanted that extra bit of oomph for the voice cloning process, which can be computationally intensive when you are trying to get the prosody and the emotional cadence just right. At $1.10 an hour, it felt like a fair trade for the speed increase. But what about the big boys? When does someone actually need to shell out $6.25 an hour for a B200?
The B200, which is based on the Blackwell architecture, is a beast designed for the massive scale out of large language models. We are talking about models with hundreds of billions or even trillions of parameters. If you are fine-tuning a Llama 370 billion parameter model, you physically cannot fit that into the 24 gigabytes of an A10 or an L4. You need the 80 gigabytes of an A100 or an H100 just to load the weights, let alone the gradients and optimizer states during training.
So it's a physical constraint first, then a performance constraint.
And the B200 brings about 192 gigabytes of HBM3E memory. That allows you to serve much larger models with much lower latency because you aren't constantly swapping data. But for most developers, the A100 is still the workhorse of the industry. At $2.50 an hour for the 80 gigabyte version on Modal, it is actually a steal when you consider that buying one used could still set you back $9,000.
$9,000 for a used card is insane. I could buy a decent used car for that. Or a very, very large supply of eucalyptus leaves and a high-end hammock.
And the car wouldn't become obsolete in 3 years. Well, maybe it would, but it would still have 4 wheels and get you from A to B. The A100 is already being eclipsed by the H100 in terms of raw FP8 performance. If you are doing serious training, pre-training, or extensive fine-tuning, the H100 is significantly faster because of the transformer engine. It can cut your training time in half compared to an A100. If you are paying by the second, cutting your time in half means you are actually saving money by using the more expensive card.
Wait, hold on. That is a brain melter. You are saying that paying $4 an hour for an H100 can be cheaper than paying $2.50 an hour for an A100.
If the H100 finishes the job more than 60% faster, then yes, the total cost of the compute job is lower on the premium hardware. This is why per-second billing is so transformative. It forces you to think about the cost per task rather than the cost per hour. On owned hardware, you don't care about the hour. The hardware is already paid for. But in the serverless world, speed is literally money.
I see. So if I have a batch of 10,000 images to generate, and the H100 can churn through them in 5 minutes while the A100 takes 20, I'm actually better off with the expensive card. It's counterintuitive, but the math checks out. But does that same logic apply to inference? Like, if I'm just chatting with a bot?
It depends on the latency requirements. If you're building a real-time voice assistant, you need the time to first token to be as low as possible. An H100 will get that first token out significantly faster than an A10. For a single user, the cost difference is fractions of a cent. But if you have 10,000 users chatting simultaneously, those fractions add up. However, for inference, the goal is usually to find the cheapest card that meets the latency threshold. If an L4 can reply in 200 milliseconds and that's fast enough for a human, there is zero reason to pay for an H100.
This really changes the game for startups, doesn't it? I mean, back in the day, if you wanted to build an AI company, you had to go raise a seed round just to buy a rack of servers. Now, you can just put $50 on a credit card and have the exact same compute power as Google or Meta for a few hours.
It has completely democratized the S in SaaS. You can build an incredibly powerful inference engine with zero capital expenditure. No data center contracts, no cooling bills, no worrying about whether your intern accidentally tripped over the power cord in the server room. You just write code, deploy to a platform like Modal, and you scale from 1 user to 10,000 users without changing anything about your infrastructure.
And then when the users go to sleep, your bill goes to zero. That is the part that still feels like magic to me. It's like a light that only costs money when someone is actually in the room looking at it.
It is the ultimate optimization of the silicon sharing economy. But we should be fair and talk about the situations where this doesn't work. If you are a massive company like OpenAI or Anthropic, and you have clusters of tens of thousands of GPUs running at 100% utilization for months at a time, serverless would be a nightmare. The margins that the cloud providers bake into those hourly rates would eat you alive. At that scale, you are better off designing your own chips, which is exactly what they are doing.
So, for the rest of us, the developers, the tinkerers, the small businesses, serverless is the way. But there is a psychological barrier, isn't it? People love owning things. There is a sense of security in knowing that the GPU is under your desk and no one can turn it off.
There is, but it is a false sense of security. If your power goes out, or your internet drops, or your fan bearing seize up, you are offline just the same, and you are the one who has to fix it. I think the bigger barrier is the fear of cloud lock-in, or unpredictable bills. If you write a buggy loop that accidentally calls an H100 10,000 times in an hour, you could wake up to a very unpleasant surprise on your statement.
Ouch. Yeah, that infinite scale works both ways if your code is trash. I suppose that is where good observability and spend limits come in. But what about privacy? If I'm running my model on someone else's A100, are they peeking at my data?
That's a common concern, especially for enterprise users. Most of these platforms use TEEs, trusted execution environments, or at the very least, very strict container isolation. Your data stays in memory, and once the container is destroyed, it's gone. It's actually often more secure than a local machine that might have malware or unpatched vulnerabilities. Plus, for many companies, the legal indemnity provided by a cloud contract is worth more than the physical control of the hardware.
Precisely. Most of these platforms now have very granular safety nets. You can set a hard cap on your monthly spend. But let's look back at the buy versus rent math for a second, because I want to touch on the L40S. That is an interesting card in the inventory. It's got 48 gigabytes of VRAM and costs about $1.95 an hour. To buy it, you're looking at $10,000. 48 gigabytes is a weird middle ground, isn't it?
It is perfect for multimodal workloads. If you are running high-resolution image generation alongside a mid-sized language model for prompting, that 48 gigabytes allows you to keep both in memory simultaneously. If you tried to do that on an A10, you'd be swapping constantly. If you did it on an H100, you'd be overpaying. The L40S is the prosumer sweet spot for complex inference.
Fun fact about the L40S, by the way, it actually lacks NVLink, which is NVIDIA's high-speed interconnect. So while it's a beast for a single node setup, it's not really meant for building massive superclusters. It's the ultimate indie dev high-end card. It's built for heavy-duty work that doesn't need to talk to 1,000 other cards at once.
It's the specialist tool. I think the real takeaway for me is that we are moving toward a world where hardware is abstracted away entirely. We are starting to treat compute like water or electricity. You don't buy a power plant to run your toaster. You just plug it into the wall.
That is exactly the direction of travel. And as the models get more efficient, things like quantization, where we can run a high-quality model in 4-bit or even 2-bit precision. The hardware requirements for the average task are actually coming down, even as the frontier models keep getting bigger.
Quantization is a real game changer. It means you can take a model that previously required an A100 and squeeze it onto an L4 or even a T4 with almost zero loss in perceived quality. That drops your hourly cost by 70% instantly. It's like discovering your toaster can suddenly run on a single AA battery.
So, what is the actionable advice here for someone listening who is about to kick off a new AI project? How do they avoid lighting money on fire?
Step 1. Calculate your duty cycle. If you aren't running at 50% utilization or higher, do not even think about buying hardware. Go serverless immediately. Step 2. Start small. Don't jump straight to an A100. Start on a T4 or an L4. See if your model fits. See what the latency looks like. You can always scale up with a single line of code later.
I'd add a step 3. Keep an eye on the per second metrics. If you see your inference taking 5 seconds on a T4 but only 0.5 seconds on an A10, do the math on the total cost per request. You might find that the expensive card is actually saving you 40% on your total bill because it finishes so much faster.
That is the pro tip. And for things like our TTS pipeline, where we value our time as much as our money, the speed boost of the A10 is worth every penny of that $10 an hour. It means we aren't sitting around waiting for audio files to render when we could be, doing literally anything else.
Like napping. Napping is a very high-value activity in my book.
I wouldn't expect anything less from a sloth. But seriously, the maturity of this market is a gift to the developer community. We have access to the most advanced silicon in human history for less than the price of a cup of coffee per hour. It's a wild time to be building.
It really is. And I think it's only going to get more interesting as the Blackwell chips start rolling out in volume. We might see another massive shift in the price-to-performance ratio by the end of the year.
I suspect you are right. The B200 is going to set a new baseline for what we consider fast. And because of platforms like Modal, we won't have to wait for some enterprise procurement department to approve a budget to try it out. We'll just update our environment variable to GPU equals B200 and see what happens.
I can't wait to see how much faster I can sound like a slightly more energetic sloth on a Blackwell chip.
Probably not much. There are some things even NVIDIA can't fix. Corn.
Hey, rude, but fair. I think we've covered a lot of ground here. The buy versus rent debate is basically over for anyone who isn't a hyperscaler. The math just doesn't favor ownership for the vast majority of use cases in 26.
It really doesn't. Between the lack of maintenance, the zero upfront cost, and the ability to instantly pivot to newer, faster hardware, serverless is the rational choice. The only exception is if you are literally mining crypto or running a massive training cluster 24/7. For everyone else, stay flexible, stay serverless, and spend that extra $3,000 on literally anything else.
Like eucalyptus, or a really nice ergonomic chair for all that napping.
Or, more compute credits for the next big project.
That too. Well, this has been a great deep dive. I feel a lot better about our A10 bill now that I know you'd have to run the show for 4 years just to break even on a purchase.
It's a relief, isn't it? It's one less thing to worry about in an already complicated tech stack.
Definitely. And it allows us to focus on the creative side. If we were busy debugging a driver conflict on a Linux box in our basement, we wouldn't have time to actually record these episodes. The opportunity cost of hardware maintenance is the real killer.
That is a point that doesn't get enough play. If your hourly rate as a developer is $100 and you spend 5 hours a month messing with CUDA drivers, you just spent $500 on your free hardware. That pays for a lot of modal credits.
My time is better spent thinking of weird prompts than thinking about kernel panics. Well, I think that is a wrap on the GPU economics for today. Thanks for the prompt, Daniel. This was a fun one to crunch the numbers on.
Thanks as always to our producer, Hilbert Flemingtop, for keeping the gears turning behind the scenes. And a big thanks to Modal for providing the GPU credits that power our search for the perfect AI voice. Without their per second billing, my wallet would be a very sad place indeed.
If you are enjoying the show, do us a favor and leave a review on whatever app you are using to listen to this. It really helps us out and keeps the GPUs humming. This has been My Weird Prompts.
See you in the next one.
Peace. This episode was produced using Google Gemini 3 Flash, text-to-speech by Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts, where our thoughts go from slow takes to facts on cue. We change and follow through. My Weird Prompts.